everyone to today's ILI Christmas webinar. I'm delighted to introduce Merit Boukelos, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And Merit is co-founder of Boukelos McAvoy Architects together with Karen McAvoy. And in 2005, he founded the School of Architecture at the University of Limerick. Merit is now head of the School of Architecture and Product Design. And as part of that work in the School of Architecture, Merit has been working on a very interesting studio project, which is about how to rebuild the Ukraine after the war. And as well as some other happenings in the university, today's talk will focus on the Dnipro River and speculation on the future of the Ukraine. So I'll hand you over to Merit now.
That's great. Thanks very much, Mark. And I'll just put some slides up. And can everybody, let's see, I'm going to go into full screen mode here. Can everybody see that? It should be a big yellow.
Yeah, it's there now, yeah.
Box. Okay, very good. So the purpose of this is really to give everybody a sense of how the School of Architecture and Product Design thinks about a place, and it kind of leads into what we're thinking about in terms of the development of new courses, and I'll get to that in the end of the talk. And this is we have been working with the School of Architecture, the Kharkiv School of Architecture, which when the war started, moved from Kharkiv to Lviv. And for about 2 years, a little more than 2 years now, around the reconstruction of and what was really interesting about the Kharkiv School of Architecture is they are thinking fundamentally about the future. And I think this is really interesting. When the war started, obviously a significant proportion of Ukraine fled. And had to leave. A significant proportion of Ukrainians became involved in the war effort, and then another significant amount are involved in thinking about the future of the city. And that's the group that we've been, kind of working with. I also want to say that we're kind of, as school connected to the one of our adjunct professors is Robert Moe, who's head of the Global Free Unit, which is basically a design studio that works in places that are going under some sort of traumatic situation or event. And it could be driven by climate change. It could be driven by political situation. And the Global Free Unit has worked in some really interesting places. So this is kind of a part of the Global Free Unit. I guess what one is trying to do in any kind of educational circumstance is, I mean, obviously you're trying to build skills and build knowledge and those kinds of things, but the other thing you're really trying to do is orient students and orient your thinking in a certain direction about the future, and to give some sort of, let me call it philosophical underpinnings, because you don't really know where students are going to graduate into. You don't know what kind of a situation they're going to graduate into and where they're going to go. And I think, when you think about the educational project more broadly, you think, well, what can it do? What can it change? What can it transform? And this is really how we've been thinking about architectural education and design education more generally. This kind of sits at the basis of what we do. And I guess the other piece of this is students, and this is really sits at our, kind of at the stem of our thinking around this, is that students are really the antennae through which the future is formulated. It isn't really the teachers, the faculty, the staff, I suppose, who, we guide, we, kind of provide some sort of structure and framework, and, all those kinds of things. But really, ideas come from the people who enter the school, and that's constantly being renewed, constantly a source of kind of like, well, the future is whoever's coming into the first class. And I think in the first year of the program, and I think this also sits at the base of, well, what can an educational institutions when they start to work together, what can they say about the future of a place? This is Oleg Drozdov, who's the head of the School of the Kharkiv School of Architecture, who's been instrumental in the effort to rethink the future of Ukraine. And we all know about what has happened there, but I guess when you see, first of all, the fact that the destruction of the place has not really, has been has happened in a kind of a terroristic fashion, where basically civilians and the civilian population has been attacked as much as the military one, and that this has had a broad impact on all kinds of very basic things like, housing, energy infrastructure, all of the systems that people kind of lean on, food, all of the things that we kind of lean on and rely on have been in some way touched by this. And this, obviously, when we started connecting with the students who were there, we realized that they were as much focused on the future as, the folks teaching and driving the schools and driving the direction of the kind of like think about the future effort. And there's something really strong to tap into there. And students have been studying in the Kharkiv School of Architecture since the war started. They immediately relocated to Lviv, and they started, kind of drawing things in relation to their new circumstances, kind of pretty much immediately. We set up this. This is some documents from a call that we put out, a workshop that happened in Lviv and Warsaw for the first time last January. The setup, the sort of the work that preceded this took about, I don't know, only 6 or 9 months. It was funded in part by the Norwegian Refugee Council and Roskevit, which is, you see the icon, the sort of folks participating in it at the bottom there, including UL, which for some reason isn't there anyway. UEMA University, which is in Sweden, and so there was a kind of a really kind of meaningful collection of partners that contributed to to the effort. So a lot of the lens through which we were trying to see this was the lens through which people were experiencing the kind of shocking loss of life, but also loss of property, loss of kind of means, and how could we start to kind of reframe that as an exercise in rebuilding. And a lot of these when you look, for example, at some of the kinds of things that have been destroyed, like apartment buildings, large, 85-90% of Ukrainians live in Soviet era concrete prefabricated apartment buildings that are pretty much all, not exactly the same, but pretty much the same. And they've all been destroyed in kind of similar ways. In other words, where a bomb lands in kind of micro districts, and all the glass, for example, in the windows are broken, which immediately means that all your apartments if it's wintertime, are suddenly freezing. And it also means that instead of the buildings falling down in total, they fall down in pieces. Parts of them crumble, and parts of them remain, which means that a lot of these buildings are partially still occupied. So we gathered in Warsaw and Lviv. So it was a group of students from Sweden, from Ireland, from Denmark, Poland, Norway, etc. And we kind of started to unpack these issues. And I wanted to talk a little bit about how we did this, rather than looking at one particular city or area. We decided to look at this in kind of 4 different scales. And we picked the Dnipro River as the largest scale. So this was the scale of, I guess you could call it a kind of a region, but it's even bigger than a region because it actually connects regions. And the Dnipro River is a little like the Shannon. It kind of drains almost 2/3 of the Ukraine, and it connects the agriculture and the energy landscapes, because the Dnipro is, there are several power stations, the hydropower stations, that are set along the Dnipro River, as well as a major, kind of way that the grain is shipped south to the ports. So it's quite an important river. It is incredibly polluted. The area around the Dnipro, which is vast, has been, industrial, is everybody knows that Ukraine is kind of one of the Europe's bread baskets. Well, this also comes along with the hyper industrial agriculture that has been produced there. So there's a huge amount of before the war of human-led, let's say, destruction of nature, which has been in a way necessary, but is really like one of the major challenging issues that we wanted to kind of think about. So it serves as it serves many functions in Ukraine. So the river scale was the Dnipro, the city scale was the city of Dnipro. The district scale was a block within the city of Dnipro, and the home scale is an apartment. And each of these was looked at. So we divided our kind of workshop into 4 different groups. They each took a different scale, basically, and studied that. So I just have some images here of the Dnipro River, but you can see, one of the big problems or events that happened in the war, at the beginning of the war, is the bombing of Zaporizhzhia Dam, and this created this massive flood, basically, which simultaneously reminded us how important all these dams are, but also what a huge catastrophe it creates when they break. And this is, of course, broken by bombing. And a lot of the and this is one of I think there's 5 different major hydro stations that have dams associated with them along the Dnipro River. So it's quite let's say that when you start to unpick the way in which the energy and the agricultural and all of the infrastructural systems kind of work together, it can't be undone very quickly. And when it does get undone very quickly, it's a huge disaster. The city region, the city of Dnipro is actually at the confluence of so the Dnipro River obviously runs through it, but Dnipro is actually kind of in the center of Ukraine. And then the district kind of piece that we looked at was one of these micro districts, and I was saying that 85% of Ukrainians live in these concrete housing blocks, but they all kind of look like what I'm showing on the plan here. In other words, these large courtyards, they're 8, 9, 10 stories high, and maybe 150, 200 meters long, and form these enormous courtyards in which they have schools and shops and things like that in them. And then home was looking at the like inside what it's like to live there. And actually, what's really interesting about the housing situation there is 85% of people live in these things, and I thought they were social housing. None of it is social housing. It was all privatized when the Iron Curtain fell, and so each of these apartment blocks is subdivided into individual ownerships of each apartment. And there's very little legislation about how all of that works. So it's quite a complex situation. So I suppose at a high level, we looked at some of we have a research methodology that we have been developing here in Limerick for quite a while, looking at the regional scale. And we sort of applied that and it really comes around a lot of work that we did around the Shannon River Basin. And we looked at European river basins. This was one of our big projects about the Shannon River, which is kind of interesting, but it was about this idea of governance and a water governed landscape. So we sort of started to apply that to Ukraine. You can see the Dnipro River is huge, goes up into Belarus and Russia, and it drains a kind of a vast area. The terrestrial ecological impact of this is also enormous. So again, using all of the data that we got was stuff that's publicly available. Ruskifit, one of the partner organizations, was very helpful in bringing a lot of the mapping together that we used to kind of assemble the information that we gave to the students. I'm just kind of flipping through this quite quickly because it was a lot of information. You can see some of the dams, for example, here. I think I said 5, but there's actually 7. And then, how the cities sit. This is Kyiv, this is Dnipro, along that river basin, just to kind of give you an idea. This was a figure ground of the city of Dnipro, and you can see the river in its kind of violence, how it, I can say this, in a way which is not unlike how the Shannon River runs through Ireland. It creates all kinds of really interesting conditions that the city kind of relies on, but also is subject to. So here we are with a student group set up in Warsaw, and that we started, with the students drawing these places, and the final exhibition was in 2 sites at once. So there was a group of students in Lviv who were in a place that actually was underground, so they didn't have to go to a bomb shelter if there was an air raid. And then they were connected via the screen up in the corner here, which is a large screen that we connected our students and the students in Lviv and the students in Warsaw to each other. So the River Studio, which was pretty interesting, applied this idea of, I mean, we did this enormous, there's a projective map, which you can see on the right-hand side here of the river, which was then drawn on top of with this idea of mythologies, because out of the river comes myths, and in fact, the Greeks were the first to visit to settle Ukraine because of the connectivity to the Black Sea to the ports, and so we started to look at this mythological history and how that could spill into the edges of the river and inform a different discourse around the kind of how the ecology of the river could promote a different attitude to the development around its edges in a much more sustainable way. At the city scale, we looked at, I'm being very quick about this, but there was just to kind of get the point across, but there was quite a bit looked at there. At the city scale, what's really interesting is the way that the Dnipro River kind of, in a way, divides the city, and that's partly to do with the topography of the city, which is quite, in Dnipro, it's quite sloped. And the river is a bit of a, not a canyon, but at least it has it does not have soft edges. And the city is built right up to those edges on the south and the north. And, you know, one looked at the city in terms of, you know, how it actually works in terms of where people live, where people work, all that kind of thing, how the networks that connect people, like, you know, public transportation, bicycling, and so on, how they are actually working. And we made some suggestions about how the water edges could be more firmly tied into the river by becoming much more green. It's quite, I mean, it's hard to emphasize, I can't emphasize enough how industrial some of these edges are right now. Some of these edges of the city are at the moment, and to make them new spaces. I guess it's important to say that part of the idea of this, like, why make a mythology of the Dnipro River? Why, you know, take an industrial wasteland and turn it into beautiful green space with parks and a much more connected city? Well, part of the idea of this was to make Ukraine also an attractive place to return to, because I said a lot of people have left. So how do you create a bridge back to Ukraine as a place to build this new future of sustainability, rather than the image of a kind of a war-torn place that has all kinds of problems, more to see it as a site of a new future based on sustainable design and based on a new way of seeing the landscape. So in the region, the district area, we actually were able to connect to some of the people who lived in some of these apartment blocks, and realize that one of the things that was kind of interesting about them was these towers that sit in the landscape. And the students came up with this idea of the third candle, which is this idea of where you can, because it was difficult for people to connect with each other because they live in these towers. They know people in the tower, but they don't necessarily know people in the other towers. And there's quite a lot of people living in these places. They're really dense. So how can we create much better connectivity in the landscape and much better connections between people? So this was sort of the, you know, the idea of that project. And they expressed it in terms of trying to build these little, literally these kind of towers of interaction within the landscape in some of the exhibition spaces that we used. They had an amphitheater, they had a pier, they had kind of this idea about being above and below the Dnipro with ecology, the Hedgehog Hotel, Safe Pavilion. Anyway, there are all these different, you know, programs that they talked about adding to the landscape that would, and it's interesting because you're also looking at a landscape that has quite a lot of green space on it, because the towers and these kind of Soviet era housing blocks actually don't take a huge amount of footprint up, so they leave a lot of landscape available. And what do you do with that? And then the home was about this idea that one of the Irish students brought of the Irish stew, which the Ukrainians got immediately because they also eat stew. And, you know, this idea of how you make something and fix your hunger through making something that, you know, food to eat comes from the landscape. And how does that make your home a place which is homey, and you feel secure and you feel familiar and you feel, you know, privacy and intimacy and all those kinds of memories kind of come together. So students in Lviv and Warsaw talked about, well, what is that idea of home exactly, and how do we bring that sense? So on the left-hand side is one of our students drew a section through an Irish stew, actually, and the Ukrainian student, Maria, was drawing her feeling of home as coziness, and what does that mean? And the students sort of worked through that in terms of, well, how could we reconfigure these concrete structures, where the contested borders between each apartment, which at the moment, because their ownership boundaries, can become places where we explore, what it means to be at home, and what privacy means, and what neighborliness means, and those kinds of things. And they ultimately kind of decided that what they needed was a place to gather, a table where they could eat and share food, and this was sort of they were thinking about the project. So that gives you a kind of a sense maybe of, and these are the two places kind of in parallel. That gives us that's a kind of a high level quick presentation of how the school thinks, and where we are going. And I wanted to touch on a couple of things. So one of the senses that I have in setting up the School of Architecture here at University of Limerick in 2005 is that that was a new school in a place that didn't have an architecture school before and had never had one. And it's always struck me as odd that there's never been a landscape architecture school outside of Dublin, because this country is fundamentally about its landscape. It's always made sense to us that there should be thinking about landscape and thinking about cities that exist somehow outside of the capital, and is able to take on the gamut of issues and problems and conditions that in fact Ireland is composed of. And so and we've kind of been building our thinking around, well, we need to have an urban design course which is focused on the fact that there really aren't we really need to increase the number of urban designers that are trained and ready to deal with all of the deep urban planning problems that we have in Ireland. And at the same time, we also have the need for landscape architects. And no more than this need for architects and product designers, there's a need for demand for landscape architects. And this comes out of situations like what we see in Ukraine, where a country that's rebuilding itself is really going to have to completely rethink its landscape, because it's not just about reconstructing buildings. And I think this is the lesson that I've certainly learned in practicing in Ireland for 30 years, that building buildings is fine, but you really need to be able to think about the landscape, and we really need to use education as a tool to up our game effectively in Ireland as to how we think about that. And I think the best way to do this is through is by creating courses in landscape architecture that are accredited by the ILI, by IFLA, and that build the knowledge and capacity in society that we need to be able to do things like what we're doing in Ukraine, and like what we're trying to do in Ireland vis-a-vis climate change. So those are things that we're working on, and we need we've been going through the process of building up a proposal for a course, and working with a small team of landscape architects, actually, to go to get it approved by the university, which is a little bit of an administrative process, actually. But we hope to be able to make an announcement, kind of a formal announcement, excuse me, about this in the springtime. And we're going to need all of your help to actually make it happen. So that's me, Mark.
That's great, Marish. If you want to get yourself a drink of water there or something, take 5 before the Q&A. So I invite anyone to pop a question into the chat, or you can put the hand up or a comment. So I suppose we have a couple of Meredith nicely knitted the studio approach and the philosophy of architecture in UL, but in a unified manner. But I suppose there's two aspects there to what he's been talking about. One is the educational scene in Ireland and future for further landscape architecture programs and then the other is the specifics of the Ukraine and the approach being taken there in Poland. And I'm going to ask a specific question, if you don't mind, on the Ukraine merit, which is maybe not part of the spirit of your presentation, but intrigues me all the same, which would be what would your own instinct be on rebuilding the housing? Do you think that the future would be where blocks can't be salvaged, that you would rebuild similar 18-story apartment blocks, or would you see a different urban fabric in residential or mixed use? What not not asking for a definitive answer, but I'm guessing you've probably considered it in your studios.
There's a lot. Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question. So when the reunification of Germany happened, there was an awful lot of Soviet-era housing projects that had been built in Eastern Germany. And at that time, there was a big theory, basically, about taking these buildings apart and using the pieces, because they were all prefabricated concrete things, to make something that was more, human scaled and so on. And then we started talking to people and realized that actually people don't actually dislike these buildings. They don't. In fact, they like them, and there's lots of reasons why they like them. And then we started looking at how they're constructed, and it's kind of interesting because when they in Germany, when they did a number of these kind of literally disassembled some of the blocks and used the parts to build something else. And you can do that with these buildings, as the bombs in Ukraine have shown us. Because when a bomb hits, because the building has been built in a stack, the stack comes down, and you can literally take the stack down and, use, and if you, not in a wartime situation, obviously, like they did in Germany, reuse it to reconstruct something. However, the thing is that the scale of this is just, it's kind of mind-boggling. When I say 85% of Ukrainians live in these things, that's like, I don't know, quite a few times the size of the population of Ireland live in buildings just like that. So you can't really, transform that. You can't change that very quickly or even at all. So, and the amount of destruction has been very, very typical, very similar. When a bomb hits these things, it has tended to take out a chunk of the building, and they need to be, and people still live in the rest of it. They don't actually abandon the whole building. And there was a very interesting study that was a book that was produced, I think, just came out at the end of the summer. A Ukrainian and a German researcher went around Ukraine over the last year, documenting a lot of not just these housing blocks that had been damaged, but what era they had been constructed in. Because behind all of this it's a little bit like automobiles. There were eras of construction that led to all these housing units being built a certain way, from 1952 to 1958, and then in 1958 they invented a new type, and from 1958 to 1964 it's another type, and then and so on. So you get up to about 1980, they were kind of, every time it was a different kind of improved, I would say, version of the same thing. And it's a very complex situation. So, and very interesting. So we are actually, this January, we're doing another one of these workshops where we're focusing in on exactly the question that you're asking, Mark, which is, well, when one of these buildings is damaged, how does it get repaired? Does it get repaired? Does it get taken down? Do we use the parts to build something else? Or, what happens exactly? And so we have a couple of engineering colleagues who are joining us for this, thing, because it involves a lot of structural engineering. And it's the scale of the problem is quite enormous. I mean, it'd be as if, I suppose, in Ireland, everybody lives in semi-Ds, apparently. It's as if everybody lives in these big slab apartment buildings, and they love them. They don't dislike them, they like them. So it's a
So
very interesting situation.
yeah, but I guess maybe, and this is a bit pessimistic maybe, but not everyone might return. So potentially in certain neighborhoods, you might have less density, might be prudent, or maybe you build capacity while you're at it. But yeah, I hear what you're saying. People, if you want to go back to the pre-war situation, you go back to the same density essentially.
Well, I mean, at the moment, these places are, I mean, the population of Ukraine is I mean, it's a very big place. 6 million people have left, so it's you know, it's people recognize that issue. You know, like how do we attract people? The Ukrainians that we're working with, one of the first thoughts that they have is how do we attract people back? You know, because we don't want the place to be empty. And how do we make this? And I think part of the envisaging of the future is about showing people how much better it could be. So that has been a little bit the thought process.
Question there from Brody McAllister, which is how can we help more on the reconstruction and redesign of Ukraine?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the institutions that are actually working on it, there aren't very many. I mean, Norman Foster, and this is part of this as a reaction to the Norman Foster reconstruction of Kharkiv project. The construction cranes and construction companies and European money is literally massing at the border of Ukraine, kind of waiting for the war to end and to kind of, you know, drop in and impose something in a way on Ukraine. And that is part of the European project of assimilation, aspects of which are very necessary because Ukraine is an incredibly, you know, it's a corrupt place, and there's no two ways of saying it. It's a difficult place to work in, difficult environment to work in. And Roskovit is an interesting organization because they're really trying to take they're asking the question, well, how can Ukrainian culture and how can Ukrainians reconstruct Ukraine? What is their idea, in fact, of reconstructing Ukraine? And I suppose it's a kind of a counter project to the Norman Foster version of, well, here's international best practice coming in and kind of figuring it all out for you. Their idea is, well, how can we use the ideas that are actually coming from the people who are from Ukraine, who are living in these places, to reconstruct the place. This next workshop is going to be focused on Odessa. So I was speaking about the reconstruction project. We're doing another one in January, which is going to take the four scales on again, but it's in a totally different city. And Odessa is a wildly different place from Dnipro. Dnipro being in the center of the very industrial, very, you know, agricultural all around. Odessa is a port city and it's just a free for all. You know, it's a total, I mean, it's just this incredible kind of place. It doesn't, you know, half of the city thinks it's not in Ukraine, you know, thinks it's in some other place, not Russia, but some other place. So, but if I was the Ukrainian, if I'm from the school of Kharkiv, the architecture school of Kharkiv, the answer to your question would be, you know, please give us a donation. But I'm not from the school and I don't want a donation, so I'm not gonna ask for that.
Yes.
But
That's a direct answer anyway to that specific question from a fictional person. Just getting back to, I suppose, the 18-story blocks and the densities. You were mentioning that there's a lot more green space than we might be used to here, and I'm wondering in Dnipro, if I'm pronouncing that right, how would you assess the quality of the green spaces, and would it differ much from block to block, or is there kind of a universal treatment?
yeah, I mean, I think like we couldn't. So for the workshop, we had a presentation from the city planners of Dnipro and from the mayor of Dnipro, and they were clearly really interested in the future, and they were interested in thinking about the future in a way that was maybe different from, I mean, there's a lot of what's the word, like any city, pressures on it, but they were definitely interested in what could we do with these green spaces, and they kind of recognized that as a, you know, as a major issue. So I think that's where it came from. Like, we're not on the ground, so, and we weren't, I think we had some Ukrainian students who were from Dnipro, and we also made contact with, we were put through the city planners, we were put in touch with a community group who was living in one of the micro districts. So we were able to, you know, kind of interact with them around kind of what they wanted. But I think it definitely is a place where you sort of say, oh, okay, if there was a city policy around urban, you know, about urban planning, it should focus on green spaces. It should focus on the development of green spaces. It should focus on, you know, what those things can bring to people to make it an attractive place to move back to. I think they kind of recognize this as being, first of all, really important. Second of all, the place that if you're talking about public money or you're talking about European investment and where that should be focused, this would be the that developing of new parks, developing of um, more what's the word, capable urban landscape, one with more value and more benefit to people, is something that they were really interested in.
Yeah. So, question then from Lucy Carey. Do you feel the cultural integrity of Ukraine has been lost with its 20th century modernist slash globalist architecture?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, the Ukraine, I'm not very well positioned to answer that because I don't, I don't know that much about Ukrainian architecture. What I've seen is exactly, it's Cacophony-esque in that you've got this huge Soviet, era influence that kind of has been, a lot of the stuff that was built after that. When we're just looking at Odessa right now, actually, and some of the development that's gone on there is just like this um, extreme version of what you see going on, kind of in any Western city that's going through some sort of a boom, that just these extraordinarily enormous and um, incongruous proposals being put forward. So I definitely think that it looks as if it's been lost, and I think this is part of the project of the Kharkiv School. I guess it's important to say that the Kharkiv School of Architecture is a private school of architecture, and it's founded on the basis that the education should be student focused. All of the state education in Ukraine has a very strict and rigorous curriculum, which is driven mainly by physics and math and technical studies. And there isn't a heck of a lot of design as such. And there certainly isn't much when you think about landscape, because that just actually becomes the remit of, one sector or another, be it industry, be it agriculture, whatever. So I think those are very, very, kind of challenging things. And I think the biggest, thing that we can try and do is create this idea that, yeah, Ukraine is a place for Ukrainians to move back to and to create and make their own, to make out of it their own new thing, to repossess it in a sense.
So, the second part of Lucy's question, then, which you've kind of answered in a way, is how would you see Ukrainian culture influencing the rebuilding of existing and new buildings and urban structure? So I think you've said that hopefully they will come back and influence it, but I suppose, do you have any ideas around how that will express itself?
I mean, okay, from an educational perspective, our theory here is that if we train young Ukrainian architects, landscape architects, to think deeply about their own culture and about how that is expressed in the futuring of their country, that is the biggest thing that we can do, because it's impossible to come from the outside and say, well, this is what it should be. So that's one very important thing. The second very important thing is um, to build useful, practical bridges for Ukrainians who have left to come back. And whether they come back to live there or whether they come back to work there and, inform and influence the development of the country. One thing I would say is that the folks that we've talked to, they're very focused on this idea of Ukrainian identity. They're not shying away from wanting to find and discover what that is. And I think, part of your question, or what sits at the bottom of it, is that, what's gone on there for the last 40 years hasn't been that. And certainly when you see the Maidan revolution in 2014, you saw the beginnings, I think, of that identity emerging. And the people there are, they're ferociously convinced about this. And it's the educational project. They see the educational project as a real, a really crucial part of making that actually happen.
Right. So, just to swing back around before we let you off to the proposal to start a landscape architecture program in UL Merit, you're hoping that you'll have 2-year master's course available for enrollment in September 2025. That's right, isn't it?
Yeah, so exactly. And Mark, where that's at is, we two landscape architects came to us in the summertime and said, hey, somebody needs to start a new school of landscape architecture somewhere. And I thought, yes, this is a brilliant idea. This needs to happen. So we started developing, I guess what you could say, the shell, what the carapace or the vessel of a course might look like, to get it through the university processes, because you can't just say, hey, we want to start a course. It has to be, there's a certain process that goes through in the university. So we have been working our way through that. There's been 1, 2, 3 kind of levels of approval that it has had to get to, and where we're at right now is we have the executive level approval, which basically means that they understand that the course is, we're going to need to hire people to teach on it. We're going to need a design studio space. This is really building on the design studio based education that we set up here. So we need design studios to be able to offer the course. And then the final level of approval will be in March when it goes in front of the Academic Policy Review Committee, which is really a content kind of assessment of an academic content part of it in terms of learning outcomes and all this kind of stuff. So at that point, we'll have a course that we can actually advertise. And yes, I would like to be able to take in students in September 2025. Now, that obviously depends on having students, show up or sign up, I should say. The model in university for postgraduate education, this is the postgraduate course, so it's not funded by the state. So the model there is very much about a mixture of students who are coming from the EU, i.e. Ireland and the rest of the EU, and students who are coming from outside of the EU. In order to get the financial aspect of it working. So we're hoping to get about 15 students. We want a studio, one design studio to start with. If we can make that happen, it'll be in September 2025 that we'll start.
Right. So just a message there from Jay Bull to say a new school of landscape architecture anywhere in Ireland, especially Limerick, would be great news for the profession and is long overdue. I wish you all the best of luck with that. And I think that's, I can safely say that's a widely held view within the profession. Obviously, we've been blessed with the output from UCD and are continued to be, but I suppose having just one school in Dublin is a bit limiting and kind of, especially for people who live elsewhere. And yeah, obviously being based in the School of Architecture there, it bodes very well for getting more trained people into our profession, which we're at the moment always looking for new practitioners. I think every practice is under pressure. So if anyone else wants to ask a question, they can do so in the next few seconds. Otherwise, we'll let Merritt get some lunch. No? Okay. Merritt, thanks very much for taking the time to give us the talk. And obviously, we'll be in touch with getting the course up and running and accredited. And wish you all the best with your work with the outreach to the Ukraine. Obviously, I think you've played down maybe the altruistic component, but clearly there. And just leads me then to wish everyone a happy Christmas from the ILI.
No, thanks very much, Mark. What I would just say is, just to add to that, is that we, and I'm very conscious of this, are going to need your help in getting this program, running. We're going to need teachers. We're going to need, it's going to go through an accreditation process. This is something that, we've been working so far with Mark and your team quite closely in terms of the process and the steps. And I really look forward to, the development of that with everybody in the landscape architecture community. So thank you for the opportunity to